I have bad news about Spider-Man 3, guys, because this game may not be as close as we thought. Based on what people have been saying lately, seeing Marvel's Spider-Man 3 before 2028 does not seem very realistic. In fact, the game will most likely be pushed to 2029 or even later. But this is not only bad news, because the longer the wait gets, the bigger the things we could see in the game may become. In this video, we're going to talk about why Spider-Man 3 could arrive late, Insomniac's plans, and what could be waiting for us on the story side when the game finally comes out. One of the most important things we need to talk about right now for Marvel's Spider-Man 3 is that the game may arrive later than we expected. Because even though the ending of Spider-Man 2 clearly opened the door for the third game, Insomniac Games' next major official project right now is Marvel's Wolverine. That's why expecting Spider-Man 3 inches, an early window like 2027 or 2028, does not seem very realistic to me. If this game is really going to feel big, final, and like the most ambitious entry in the series so far, then seeing it after 2028, maybe around 2029 or 2030, makes much more sense. I think the important question here is not just, will the game come out late? The real issue is this: if Marvel's Spider-Man 3 really arrives after 2028, what will Insomniac use all that extra time for? Because at the end of Spider-Man 2, we have so many unfinished storylines. Norman Osborn's anger, Otto Octavius' return, the introduction of Cindy Moon, Carnage still being out there, and the new balance between Peter and Miles all show that the third game could turn into a much bigger story. When we look at the ending of Spider-Man 2, the clearest setup is through Norman Osborn. Norman blames the Spider-Men for what happened to Harry, and that anger pushes him into a very dark place. The whole G-Serum situation also comes into play here. Since the first game, Insomniac has not used Norman like an ordinary side character. They have slowly prepared him as someone who could turn into a major disaster. That's why I think the possibility of seeing Green Goblin in Marvel's Spider-Man 3 is one of the strongest expectations for the series. Green Goblin being the main villain of the third game would make a lot of sense not only for comic book fans, but also for the story of this game universe. Because Norman Osborn is not just a villain who affects Peter Parker's life from the outside, through Harry, through Oscorp, through his past decisions, and through his impact on the future of the city, he is a character standing at the center of this universe. If the third game is going to tell a more personal, darker, and more emotional story for Peter, Norman's transformation into Green Goblin could be the strongest foundation for that. But I also do not think the story will move forward only through Green Goblin. Because at the end of Spider-Man 2, Otto Octavius appears again and says he is working on the final chapter. I think that line was written very intentionally. In the first game, Otto was one of Peter's biggest tragedies, and bringing this character back into the story in the third game could make everything much more personal. If Norman and Otto are part of the same story, Spider-Man 3 could become not just a major superhero game, but a much heavier final chapter where Peter Parker faces his past. Peter Parker's side is also very important here. After the ending of Spider-Man 2, some players thought Peter would step aside and that the story would be completely handed over to Miles Morales. But I do not think Insomniac will handle it that simply. Peter being tired, wanting to share the responsibility, and trying to balance his life a little more does not mean he will leave the story. On the contrary, I think it is more likely that Peter will face a huge test again in Spider-Man 3. Miles Morales is no longer positioned like the second Spider-Man, but truly as one of New York's main heroes. Throughout Spider-Man 2, we saw how much Miles grew, both in terms of power and character. It is very likely that he will be even more central in the third game. Especially while Peter is dealing with enemies from his past, we may see Miles carrying more of the city's present-day burden. This could make the game not just Peter's final story, but also the story of Miles truly rising into leadership. One of the most interesting details here is Cindy Moon. The introduction of Cindy at the end of Spider-Man 2 definitely does not feel like a coincidence. In the comics, Cindy Moon becomes Silk, and she has a very important place in Spider-Man mythology. If Insomniac did not introduce this character just as a small post-credit surprise, then the possibility of seeing Silk in Spider-Man 3 or in another future game is seriously on the table. That could completely change the number of playable characters and the story structure of the third game. If Peter, Miles, and Cindy all become active in the same universe in Spider-Man 3, Insomniac would need to design a much bigger game. Because 3 different Spider characters means 3 different character dynamics, 3 different ability systems, and 3 different story perspectives. If something like this happens, the game would not only become bigger, but the formula of the series would also change. Switching between Peter and Miles in Spider-Man 2 was a lot of fun, but with Silk being added in the third game, that system could become much wider. Of course, we need to be careful here, because it would not be right to say that Silk will definitely be playable in Spider-Man 3. Right now, all we have is the introduction of Cindy Moon. But when we look at Insomniac's storytelling style, we can say they probably did not show a character like this for no reason. Maybe in the third game, we see a side story where Cindy is just discovering her powers, maybe she appears as Silk at the end of the game, or maybe it sets up a future spin-off. But no matter what, Cindy Moon is now part of this universe. Carnage is also an important topic that needs to be discussed for Spider-Man 3. In Spider-Man 2, Cletus Cassidy's story was not fully resolved, and the fact that he disappeared with a symbiote sample was left as a major threat. If Spider-Man 2 did not get a story DLC, then it becomes much more likely that this storyline will be carried into a future game. Carnage may not be as personal of a villain as Green Goblin, but he could be a much more violent, chaotic, and difficult to control threat for the city. I think it would make more sense to see Carnage in Spider-Man 3 as a dangerous side threat within the larger story rather than as the main villain, because Green Goblin and Otto Octavius are already very powerful characters for Peter's personal story. Carnage, on the other hand, could add a darker, more violent, and more chaotic energy to the game. Maybe he appears in one section of the main story, maybe in a major side mission chain, or maybe as a threat that completely disrupts the balance in the middle of the game. But one way or another, this storyline needs closure. When it comes to Venom, we should not exaggerate too much, because a separate Venom game has been discussed for a long time, but right now, there is no officially announced Venom game. So when evaluating Spider-Man 3's release date, we cannot completely ignore the Venom possibility, but we also should not build the entire video around it. If the Venom spin-off really happens, Spider-Man 3 could naturally move to a later date. But if that project has been cancelled or shelved, Insomniac could devote more resources directly to Spider-Man 3. That's why the most logical release timeline to me looks like this. Spider-Man 3 could be the next major Marvel project after Wolverine, but it is unlikely to arrive immediately after it. After Wolverine releases in 2026, Insomniac will probably need a few years for the new Spider-Man game. Games at this scale are no longer made in just 2 years like before, especially if Spider-Man 3 is going to feel like a major conclusion in terms of story and also push the series forward in gameplay. A 2029 or 2030 estimate feels more realistic to me. This late release possibility may disappoint some players, but on the other hand, it could also be good for the game's quality. Because even though Spider-Man 2 was a great game, some players wanted the story to be longer, some side characters to be explored more, and some threats to be developed in more detail. If Spider-Man 3 gets a longer development period, Insomniac can take those criticisms into account and prepare a much fuller game. They especially need to avoid rushing a massive character like Green Goblin. On the gameplay side, the third game would also be expected to bring much bigger innovations. In Spider-Man 2, web wings, faster city traversal, Peter and Miles' different powers, and more cinematic battles push the series forward. But in Spider-Man 3, players will now expect a bigger leap. A larger New York, more indoor missions, more advanced boss fights, smarter enemy AI, and mission designs that change based on the character would not be surprising at all. Insomniac also needs to strengthen the city side of the game. The map grew in Spider-Man 2, but in the third game, players will not just want a larger area, they will want a more alive city. Norman Osborn's rise, Oscorp's influence over the city, possible goblin attacks, chaotic threats like Carnage, and maybe even the appearance of Silk could make New York feel much more active. If the game really comes out around 2029 or 2030, we could technically see a much denser and more detailed city. In terms of story structure, I also think Spider-Man 3 will have a more mature tone. The first game told the story of Peter's heroic responsibility and his tragedy with Otto. The Miles Morales game was about Miles finding his own hero identity. Spider-Man 2 showed Peter and Miles learning to work together while facing the dark side through the Venom threat. The third game could be a much bigger and more emotional reckoning that brings the results of all these stories together. The conflict between Peter, Miles, and Norman offers an especially strong dramatic foundation. Norman may see the Spider-Men as the people who destroyed his son's life. Peter may feel guilty both because of his bond with Harry and because of Norman's transformation. Miles, meanwhile, may try to protect his own city while also helping carry Peter's burden in the middle of all this chaos. If written well, this kind of story could make Spider-Man 3 the most emotional game in the series. I think this is where Spider-Man 3's biggest potential lies. This will not just be a sequel about new suits, new powers, and new boss fights. If Insomniac really uses all the setups they have, we could get a massive game where Peter Parker's past, Miles Morales' future, Norman Osborn's downfall, Otto Octavius' final move, Cindy Moon's rise, and uncontrolled threats like Carnage all come together in the same story. So even if the game arrives late, it could be big enough to be worth the wait. So do you think 2029 is too late for Spider-Man 3, or is a game this big worth waiting for? Make sure to write it in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because as new developments come in about Spider-Man 3, Wolverine, Venom, and other major PlayStation games, we'll talk about all of them here. I'll see you in the next video.